He's a co-recipient of the 2018 Nobel Memorial Prize in Economics for developing the endogenous growth theory, which argues that investments in human capital, innovation and knowledge are significant contributors to economic growth. Please welcome on stage, Paul Romer.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here. You'll notice how little confidence they had in my ability to explain myself clearly. I'm one who has to have someone come along afterwards to query me to help make sense of the inexplicable things I say. But be that as it may, I think much of my work has been focused on the power of technology, and this is obvious in all of our lives. The force I want to focus on right now are changes at the level of our governance, the systems of governance we use to cooperate. And we've gone through a period where the traditional national leaders have governments that are in retreat. They're weaker. They've become weaker over time. At the same time, the catching up nations that were once poor and are now are middle income, soon to be rich, have retained a commitment to a government which is assertive on many important dimensions. And this combination of weakening government in the traditional leaders, strong government in the newly emerging powers, has important implications for your industry. The first is that I think we've entered into a period where we will see less growth in merchandise trade. I think there's little that can be done to turn this around in the short run. In the long run, it could be addressed, and I think this industry could be a voice that helps address it. But I need to explain why these two visions of government have led to that outcome. Second, I think there's a new generation of pirates that threaten not just your industry, but every industry in the world, the platform pirates. And I think you should think pretty carefully and pretty quickly about how you want to protect yourself from the new pirates, because the governments are not going to do it. Finally, we've got mixed messages at the level of protecting the environment. As other countries grow rich and as they have assertive governments, we'll see local actions to protect the environment. But at the global stage, on the global stage right now, we've suffered from a loss of leadership. So let me just step back and say that if you think about what's so remarkable about humans, it's this mixture we have for being selfish, for being ambitious, for striving. This is the thing that drives all of this innovation and new technology. But alongside of that selfishness, there's some degree of groupishness. We care about a group that we're a part of. We're willing to do some things to protect the group. And the degree to which we're willing to sacrifice our selfish instincts and support the groupish instincts can be adjusted. You can turn this dial up and down. And in general, as the world becomes more closely integrated, as scale and complexity goes up, it's very important that we keep turning up the dial and encouraging people to think about what's good for the group. Now, to illustrate why this is important, think about the most important new technology in all of human history. It was the city. It was urban settlement, supported by agriculture that was stationary rather than in bands that were chasing game and opportunity. When people first moved into cities, they got enormous benefits out of the division of labor that let them specialize and become better and better in producing just one thing, but still consuming as generalists by exchanging with everyone else in this area. But there was a downside to life in the city. People died sooner because of communicable disease that was more common within cities. And it took quite some time before governments managed to establish the level of group-level protection that limited the danger of communicable disease, including enforcing measures of sanitation that protected the water supply. But to make progress, we needed both the innovation and the dynamism of the market and individual self-interest in the city, and the government which limited the negative side effects of this new development. Looking around today, you can see familiar measures like public health, protecting public health. One example is limiting smoking. Smoking in general in the population, particularly smoking in bars, where the government in New York City, for example, said, this has to stop. It said it would stop. Everyone thought it was going to be controversial. There'd be a huge backlash. It would be a disaster. In fact, once the law took effect, it was like a bit flip. It just stopped. The problem went away. I don't think anybody got a ticket for smoking in a bar. People started enforcing this through norms. It was just wrong, and we solved the problem. In the same way, in the 1980s, we decided we have to stop emitting chlorofluorocarbons into the atmosphere because it was destroying the ozone layer. Once again, a national government took the lead in saying, we're going to ban the use of these chemicals, and then we negotiated a worldwide treaty, and it has saved the ozone layer. The problem is that we're in a period where we cannot expect that kind of action on the problems we face. Problems like carbon emissions, to be sure, and a growing awareness, especially in this industry, of the threat from the dissemination of plastics throughout the environment. Now, this retreat by government is at least partly the result of an ideological campaign mounted by economists, people I knew at the University of Chicago, a remarkably successful campaign to sell this idea of a minimal state, the state that does as little as possible. This was appealing to the left because the left didn't like this idea of a government that could use coercion. The police could stop you from smoking in the bar. It appealed to the libertarian right, who had these notions of freedom, which is that everybody should be able to do anything they want. The left in particular, I think, failed to understand that the norms of persuasion, this is wrong to smoke in a bar and subject other people to secondhand smoke, those norms could develop and were protected by the willingness of the state to use its powers of coercion, if it had to stop people who didn't comply with the norms. Because a few who don't comply can destroy the whole agreement, can turn everybody back into those self-centered, selfish types who don't care about what's good for everyone. So what it means is, in today's world, there are few intellectual voices willing to make the kind of defense, the vocal, explicit defense that we need of governments that can use their powers to protect what's good for the group. And to be sure, do it largely by encouraging the right kinds of norms and values that make the right behaviors automatic in most communities, but still to stand ready to use the powers of enforcement where necessary. So how does this show up in the world trading system? Well, the world trading system that we live with right now was premised on a diplomatic fiction, which was that all nations would converge to this model of the minimal state articulated by these folks from the University of Chicago. It allowed for the idea that a government could use taxes and transfers to support some kind of a social welfare system, but in the operation of the market, the government would pull back. And that meant there were no subsidies, no state-owned enterprises, no industrial policy, no adjustment of the exchange rate to achieve some kind of economic goal, and a strong amount of respect for intellectual property rights for knowledge established in other parts of the world. Now, there was never a consensus that all nations would adopt this model. The lack of consensus was papered over by granting temporary exemption to developing countries that clearly did not buy this vision of the government. But now, after a period of very rapid growth in those countries, we're getting to the point where we can't maintain that fiction any longer. That during the period, the advantage of the fiction was that we did have a period of very rapid growth from about 1980 up through about 2008, very rapid growth in GDP, rapid growth in trade along with it. But the fiction now has caused misunderstandings, which are causing the kind of open conflict that we now see. The sense in the United States is that a country like China is reneging on a firm commitment that it made to run its economy the same way the United States runs its economy. The Chinese feel like they never made that commitment and don't understand the presumption of the United States to say that we're going to come in and tell you, even in your legislation, how you're going to relate to your industries and whether or not you're going to have state-owned firms. So the fiction has fallen. We're now dealing with a system where there's really a fundamental divide between the way the Chinese in particular imagine their economy moving forward and the way the United States operates. And unfortunately, the rules of trade that we agreed to were all predicated on this US minimal government model, and we're at an impasse about how to proceed. It's of course possible to have rules that govern trade between nations that have different economic models, but those are not the rules that were built into the WTO, and it will take some time to create those new rules and sustain global integration, even when governments adopt different approaches. It will be important in getting to that new system of rules if there's a clear voice that's making the case for the value of global integration in a way which is not ideologically tied to any particular system of government regulation of the economy. And this industry could be one of those voices making that pragmatic argument for continued increases in global integration. Now, one of the defenses that economists made of the ability of the government to step back was that competition would discipline bad behavior in the private sector. But that's predicated on the existence of competition, which we once recognized was one of the tasks of the government, to protect competition. Governments here too have retreated, and especially in the United States, have not made any important efforts to defend competition. So we've created an opening for this new generation of platform pirates who can enter in any industry now using information technology, create a platform which connects buyers and sellers. And the process here is very simple. You start with a lot of cash up front, you offer your platform at no charge, you run at losses for a long period of time, everybody joins the platform, and then once it's got this position that's entrenched and there's no other alternatives, it can exploit the power of monopoly and extract huge profits. This is not just an abstract threat in your industry. There's a firm, Flexport, which has clearly got this opportunity in mind. They tried to recruit me as their chief economist. You can't imagine how short that conversation was. But there is a model that you could use that is one I studied when I was thinking about how industries support R&D, which was a group called CableLabs that was created to protect the cable industry when they saw the same risk of a monopolist that could enter and extract all the profit from their business. The critical thing that CableLabs did was enforce standards of interoperability between all of the different types of suppliers of hardware or software to the cable industry. It did other kinds of applied research, but it was the standards and the interoperability that protected them from a platform pirate. And I think it would be very timely for you to think about some organization like that. I don't think that the IMO can actually take on this responsibility because it's got to be proactive, technology sophisticated, and not slowed down by the kind of constraints that you need in a regulatory rule-setting process. But you know, the pirates are coming. Finally, on the environment, it's really amazing how much change we've seen since the mid-'80s when we protected the planet from destruction of the ozone layer to the situation we're now in where we're not protecting the planet from continued emissions of carbon. This is not an impossible problem to solve. Before we solved the ozone problem, there were people, dire voices saying life would not continue. Life as we know it wouldn't be possible without chlorofluorocarbons. Now, if you think back, I don't remember a big disruption in life as I knew it in the mid-'80s because we got rid of chlorofluorocarbons, and probably you don't either. It was really a minor problem to address once we specified through our governments that this is something we had to do. And I think in the same way, when we finally impose the rules that decarbonize the energy system, it won't be nearly as disruptive as people think. But it won't happen just by persuasion. It's going to take rules. And in the same way, we're going to find substitutes for some of these plastics that are causing such extensive and durable pollution. But persuasion alone will not get us there. Under the right rules, persuasion can work to keep us all thinking about what's good for the group. But absent the rules, those norms about what's right and wrong will not survive. So this industry, I think, could take the lead on some pollution issues, carbon perhaps even more prominently on plastics, and help guide us all towards the ultimate solution. One way to do this is to fight back against the strategy that industries have typically used to protect their ability to keep causing harm to make money. The smoking industry made money for decades, about $10,000 per additional event of early mortality. So think about that kind of calculus, $10,000 per person who dies. They did this for decades by injecting noise into the debate about the health harms from smoking. And it took a long time before governments finally started to make assertive steps, like in New York City saying, we're just going to ban smoking in bars and restaurants. The best way to fight the noise is clarity, clear statement of the facts. And this industry could help drive towards more clarity about the seriousness of these industries, especially plastics, which isn't as well recognized. If you think about what kinds of measures have really made a difference in the environment, what's the most cost-effective measure that you can think of? For me, it's when the United States started putting out on the Chinese version of Twitter its own measurements at its embassy of air quality in Beijing. Just by producing reliable, trustworthy information about air quality in Beijing, the United States dramatically raised awareness of this problem in China. It was treated initially as if it were an act of war by the Chinese government, but they eventually had to accommodate it and started meeting the broader demand amongst their citizens for reliable information, and they're now in the process of making real progress in reducing air pollution. So trustworthy information that clearly demonstrates the seriousness of the problem can be a clear force for a solution to it. And we need more trustworthy voices on these issues about carbon, about ways to avoid the use of carbon, and about the damage from things like plastics. And it's important as well for there to be voices that say, this must stop. We can't go on as a group unless we stop this. But then to go on and say, and here's the next step we have to take. Because it's on the next step decision where the entities that want to prevent any action can inject noise and delay action indefinitely. So to conclude, let me just use an example of an absence of an effective government that is visible in the newspapers right now. On Mount Everest, there's been entry of so many different teams trying to climb to the top that it's suffering from serious problems of congestion. You can't get all of the people to the top, given the constraints of weather and the logistics. They can't get as many people to the top as have now entered. Now, congestion's a classic example where governments can act to make everyone better off, but it's hard to get them to act. If you think about what's so damaging about a failure of any entity that prevents congestion by saying there's only so many trips that can be permitted, only so many people, perhaps people as well have to have this level of training to be able to go on these trips. Absent that kind of government setting of the rules, what we're seeing is an experience on Everest which is much degraded for those who try and pursue it. But worst of all, what we're seeing is this very ugly side of human behavior. People jostle. People are careless. People are insensitive to suffering. Many people are dying now on Everest, and others just walk by. There's no longer that spirit of pitching in to help somebody who's in trouble, because these kind of selfish needs, selfish urges have come to the forefront in an environment where we don't have any entity which is protecting the group as a whole. So if not for the material, practical benefits we could get from stronger government, at least let's have governments and organizations that defend the interests of the group, because it helps us be the kind of people that we really want to be. Thank you. So, Alan Greenspan once said that if you think you understood what I said, then I must have misspoken. So, what would you like to clarify?
I think there's a lot of things to clarify, but first of all, Professor Romer, thank you so much for a very inspiring, interesting speech. You take us from a high level of theoretical, much higher level of theory than most of us here are, down to more practical issue and how it hits us. And you talk about these 3 disruptive forces, which really hits us simultaneously, at the same time, seriously, which we all need to deal with, because we also here in industry, which is a global industry.
And remember, some of those disruptive forces are beneficial, like urbanization, but they still call for some kind of protection of the group to really get the benefits from them. So the goal is not to stop disruption, to stop change, but it's to do it in a way where we maximize the benefit.
Yeah, and then we're into what the first question I would like to raise is with you, because you talk about the environmental challenge and how the governments are missing in action in the fight to limit pollution. And you said the governments tend to end up with treaties more than actions in order to reduce environmental impact. And you call it the paralyzed national government. So why has this happened? And well, what does it take to change it?
Yeah, I think the contrast I would draw would be between, and this is specific to the United States, the case that I'm most familiar with, the contrast is between the decisive response to the evidence that chlorofluorocarbons were destroying the ozone layer. That led to legislation, a treaty worldwide, substitute chemicals, and a very good outcome. Contrast that with the response to the evidence that emerged in the 1960s that cigarettes were killing people. There was a very well-organized industry which spent lots of money, injected enough noise to stop governments from acting on this very serious health threat for decades. And what we're facing now is, frankly, this ideological movement which has drained power and resources from governments and industries which are well enough financed so that they can inject noise and prevent action. So we need, more than anything, clarity to stop the noise, and then specifics about next steps that we could give to governments and say, this is what we have to do.
Yes, because you say the industry should take responsibility for negotiating and to go ahead of the governments, and then they will follow. But do you think is it that realistic?
I think that in a domain like in shipping, if the industry comes to a consensus about regulations that could be established and enforced, and it sets as a norm, this is what we have to do as a group, it could then ask governments to join in and enforce those rules. So even if the bad actors can stop governments from coming to a consensus about the rules, if the industry presents the rules to the government and says, look, all you've got to do is enforce them. Every ship that comes into your ports, just make sure they're following these rules that we've all agreed to. Then I think you can maintain the commitment to those rules that you need to avoid them from collapsing, and you can short-circuit this process of arguing about what the rules should be.
So what you're actually saying is we need much more of the IMO decisions we've had for 2020, and also what we need to do for the industry going forward. I will also like to ask you a question on this, your critical view on a new breed of technology, pirates. You talk about the pirates coming. And you mentioned some, but we all know them as some of the Alibaba or the Amazon or the Facebook of this world. And is the power of this platform really such an unstoppable force? And what business models will it demand from the maritime industry to challenge this threat?
So it's like in the 60s we could have said about cigarettes. Is the power of this sort of damaging business model that kills people to make money, is this so powerful? And the answer is, absent government action, it is so powerful. But as soon as governments act, it can stop. So governments could stop these platforms from becoming monopolists. The critical requirement is to impose interoperability, so that if somebody's offering a platform that you use to match shippers and shipping firms, you could have multiple versions of those platforms that compete with each other as long as you've got interoperability. But if one firm can have its own proprietary solution, then it can lock everybody in, and then we're doomed to kind of letting that firm control everything about interactions between buyers and sellers. So we need to have governments that are willing to force basic kind of conventions like interoperability that can sustain competition. We should also have governments which are willing to enforce things like limits on mergers as well. You could easily get several competing platforms all operating independently, what looks like a system with good competition, and then boom, they all merge and you're back with a monopolist that nobody can escape from. So it's a pretty standard set of requirements about limiting mergers and requiring interoperability that if governments insisted on, we could avoid this problem of monopoly control.
In the maritime industry, we start to see more of the mergers or acquisitions along the value chain. But that's somewhat different in a way than what you are talking about.
Yeah, I think there are arguments, efficiency arguments about the benefits of certain kinds of mergers. I think the thing that we haven't had clarity about, though, is that there are risks. There are real risks here. And this isn't just about the efficiency of production. When firms get too large and too powerful, again, think of the cigarette firms. They can undercut the whole process of governance, which is the only way to keep them in check. So I think we need to be careful about letting firms get too powerful, having too much concentrated control, because we've always known that it's concentrated power and control that can threaten the interests of the group.
Thank you, Professor Romer. It's a pleasure to have you here. Give him a big hand.